March 7, 1945, 2:40 p.m., near the town of Remagen, Germany. The message arrived in fragments. Radio static crackled across the command net of the U.S. First Army as reconnaissance officers struggled to confirm what seemed impossible. The bridge at Remagen was still standing. For months, Allied commanders had assumed every crossing over the Rhine would be destroyed the moment their forces approached. The river was Germany's final defensive barrier in the west, a cold, fast-moving wall of water nearly 400 meters wide in places, backed by artillery, fortifications, and the desperate remnants of the Wehrmacht. Yet now, field reports insisted that the Ludendorff Bridge, a steel railway span stretching 325 meters across the Rhine, remained intact. American soldiers were already running toward it. Inside the forward headquarters of the U.S. 12th Army Group, General Omar Bradley listened as the situation unfolded over the radio. The officer on the line spoke rapidly. German engineers had tried to demolish the bridge minutes earlier. The explosives had detonated, but the structure had only sagged, not collapsed. Smoke hung over the river while stunned American infantry from the 9th Armored Division surged forward. It was the kind of opportunity generals spent entire campaigns waiting for. But there was a problem, a very large problem. Supreme Allied Headquarters, SHAEF, commanded by Dwight Eisenhower, had already decided the Rhine crossing strategy. Bridges were to be destroyed. Assault crossings would come later, carefully planned, heavily supplied, and executed simultaneously along a broad front. Nothing was to be rushed. The Allies would cross the Rhine on their timetable. Not this afternoon, and certainly not because a battlefield accident had left a bridge standing. Bradley understood the implications instantly. If American forces seized the bridgehead now, they would be deep across Germany's final natural defense line before SHAEF had approved the operation. Supply lines were unprepared, artillery support was limited, German counterattacks could trap thousands of soldiers on the eastern bank. Strategically, it violated the plan, but tactically, it was irresistible. Within minutes, another voice entered the conversation, one Bradley knew well. General George S. Patton. Patton's Third Army had spent months racing across France with a single obsession: reach the Rhine first. His columns were already probing south of Remagen, hunting desperately for any crossing point the Germans had failed to destroy. The discovery of the Ludendorff Bridge changed everything. Patton wanted it. High Command would almost certainly forbid it. Bradley now faced a decision that existed in the narrow space between obedience and opportunity. If he waited for authorization, the Germans would finish demolishing the bridge. If he acted now, he would be overruling the carefully constructed strategy of the entire Allied command. The radio line went silent for several seconds. Then, Bradley gave the order that would quietly bypass the machinery of SHAEF. Patton was to move, not publicly, not formally, but unmistakably. Seize the bridgehead, expand it, hold it. Eisenhower could be informed later, because once American troops were across the Rhine, no one, no matter how high their authority, would order them back. March 7, 1945, late afternoon. Headquarters, U.S. 12th Army Group. The Rhine had dominated German military planning for nearly 2,000 years. From the Roman legions to the Prussian armies of the 19th century, the river had always served the same purpose: a natural frontier, a defensive wall between Germany and the armies of the West. In 1945, it carried even greater meaning. For the collapsing Third Reich, the Rhine was not simply geography, it was the last line of national survival. By early March, the armies of the Western Allies had driven German forces back across hundreds of kilometers of shattered territory. Cities like Cologne and Bonn had already fallen. Bridges had been blown, railways twisted, and entire divisions destroyed. But the German High Command believed one truth still remained. If the Rhine held, Germany might yet slow the Allied advance long enough to stabilize the front, or perhaps force a negotiated peace with the Western powers before the Soviet armies reached Berlin. Every major bridge was therefore wired with explosives. Orders were absolute: destroy them the moment enemy troops approached. That was the plan. Reality proved less obedient. At Remagen, the German engineers responsible for demolishing the Ludendorff Bridge had received conflicting orders throughout the day. Explosives had been moved, reinstalled, and partially removed as officers debated when to detonate the charges. The final attempt had been rushed. The result was catastrophic for the Germans. When the charges exploded shortly before 4 p.m., the blast tore a hole through the deck and damaged several support beams, but the bridge did not collapse. Thick steel arches absorbed the shock. The main structure remained standing. For American soldiers advancing through the smoke, the opportunity was unmistakable. Men from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion sprinted forward, bullets snapping past them as German machine guns opened fire from the eastern bank. Engineers crawled across the damaged roadway, cutting wires and defusing remaining demolition charges as artillery shells crashed around them. Within minutes, the first American troops reached the far side. It was the first Allied crossing of the Rhine, and it had not been authorized. Inside the Allied command structure, this created a crisis. The strategic plan designed by Dwight Eisenhower envisioned a massive, coordinated assault weeks later. British and American forces would cross the river simultaneously along a wide front, supported by airborne divisions and overwhelming artillery. It would be deliberate, controlled, irrefutable. What was happening at Remagen was the opposite: a single damaged bridge, a handful of infantry, no prepared supply routes, no defensive depth on the far bank. From a strategic perspective, it looked reckless, but to the men fighting there, hesitation was impossible. Reports flooded up the chain of command as American units poured across the bridge. By evening, hundreds of soldiers had reached the eastern bank, establishing a fragile foothold among the hills overlooking the Rhine. German commanders reacted with fury. Field Marshal Walter Model, responsible for defending the Western Front, immediately ordered the bridge destroyed at any cost. Artillery batteries opened fire. Luftwaffe aircraft were scrambled for bombing runs. Engineers prepared underwater demolition teams. The orders were simple. The bridge collapsed before the Americans could reinforce it. Back at Bradley's headquarters, the implications were becoming clear. If the crossing succeeded, the Allies would have achieved the single objective every general in Europe had been preparing for months to accomplish, but they would have done it accidentally and without permission. Bradley understood what came next. Sooner or later, Schaeff would demand answers. Sooner or later, George Patton would call again. Because if one bridge across the Rhine could be taken by surprise, others might be seized the same way. March 8, 1945. Early morning. 3rd Army Headquarters, Luxembourg. The news reached General George S. Patton before sunrise. An aide burst into the operations room carrying a bundle of overnight situation reports. The message was brief but astonishing. American troops had crossed the Rhine at Remagen and were holding a bridgehead. Patton read the dispatch once, then again. For months, he had driven his Third Army across France and into Germany with relentless speed, convinced that momentum, not caution, won wars. Again and again, he had argued that the Rhine should be seized whenever the opportunity appeared, not according to a distant headquarters timetable. Now the opportunity had arrived, and it had happened somewhere else. Patton's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. "We can cross the Rhine," he told his staff, "and we will." But the reality of Allied command structure imposed limits even on Patton's aggression. All major operations required approval from Supreme Headquarters under Dwight D. Eisenhower. The plan for crossing the Rhine had already been set in motion elsewhere, primarily under the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in the north. Patton's Third Army was not scheduled to cross yet, not officially. Yet Patton understood something others did not. The moment a single Allied bridgehead existed across the Rhine, the psychological barrier surrounding the river began to collapse. The myth of the Rhine as Germany's impenetrable shield was already fading, and Patton had no intention of watching from the sidelines. He contacted his superior, Omar Bradley. Bradley knew precisely what Patton wanted even before the conversation began. Field reports from Remagen were growing more dramatic by the hour. Engineers had reinforced the damaged Ludendorff Bridge overnight, while additional units crossed to expand the fragile perimeter. Thousands of American troops were now east of the Rhine. German artillery pounded the structure continuously, but it remained standing. For Bradley, the situation was both brilliant and dangerous. The official strategy still demanded caution. Logistics officers warned that supply lines across the bridge were fragile. A successful German counterattack could isolate the bridgehead and destroy the troops holding it. But every passing hour strengthened the American position, and every passing hour made it harder for anyone to reverse the decision. Patton's voice over the line was direct. He proposed something even more audacious. If Remagen could be exploited, then Third Army should begin preparing additional crossings farther south. His engineers could assemble pontoon bridges. Assault units could be ready within days, perhaps sooner. Patton's request was not technically a violation of orders, but it stretched them. Bradley understood the deeper issue. Once Patton moved, the initiative of the war would shift decisively to the field commanders, rather than the planners at SHAEF. That was not how the Allied coalition normally operated. The Western Allies were a vast machine, millions of soldiers, thousands of ships, endless supply convoys stretching across continents. Its strength came from coordination, from carefully synchronized operations. Yet history had a way of ignoring carefully drafted plans. Bradley paused before answering. Then he gave Patton the same quiet permission he had given the troops at Remagen. Prepare the crossings, move the engineers. If the opportunity came, take it. The instruction was not written as a formal order. It did not need to be. Both men understood what it meant. The Rhine, Germany's final western barrier, was no longer being approached cautiously. It was being hunted. And once Patton's armies began moving toward the river, events would accelerate beyond the control of even the highest command. March 9, 1945. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, in Reims, France. By the morning of March 9, the situation could no longer be contained. Reports from the Rhine were arriving hourly at the headquarters of Dwight Eisenhower. Each update carried the same unsettling message. The bridgehead at Remagen was not collapsing. It was expanding. More than 8,000 American troops were now east of the Rhine. Engineers had laid temporary reinforcement plates across the damaged sections of the Ludendorff Bridge. Bulldozers cleared debris while military police directed a constant flow of trucks, artillery pieces, and infantry columns across the span. Against every prediction, the crossing was holding. German commanders reacted with desperation. Field Marshal Walter Model ordered a relentless campaign to destroy the bridge. Artillery batteries fired day and night. Fighter bombers dove through anti-aircraft fire in repeated attacks. Even experimental rocket weapons were deployed in a frantic attempt to collapse the structure. None succeeded. The Rhine had been breached. Inside SHAEF, the tone shifted from caution to reluctant acceptance. The strategic crossing planned for weeks later now seemed almost redundant. The Americans had already achieved what the plan intended, but the implications were uncomfortable. The first Allied crossing of Germany's greatest defensive river had occurred not through deliberate strategy, but through battlefield improvisation, and it had happened without formal authorization. At the center of that quiet defiance stood Omar Bradley. Bradley's communications with forward commanders revealed a careful balancing act. He had not openly contradicted SHAEF orders. There was no document explicitly commanding the seizure of the bridge. Yet the message he sent to the field had been unmistakable. If the bridge could be taken, take it. If it could be held, hold it. Now the consequences were irreversible. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers to the south, George S. Patton was moving faster than anyone at SHAEF expected. Pontoon bridges were being assembled along the Rhine near the town of Oppenheim. Engineers worked through the night while reconnaissance units probed the eastern bank. Patton understood that speed mattered more than perfect preparation. If he crossed before the Germans could reorganize, the entire Western Front might collapse. On the evening of March 22nd, just 2 weeks after Remagen, Patton's Third Army launched its assault crossing. Within hours, American infantry and armored units were pouring across floating bridges south of Mainz. German resistance was scattered and disorganized. Entire defensive sectors collapsed before they could mount a coordinated defense. Patton later recorded the moment with characteristic pride. "Brad and I have got the Rhine, and we did it without asking anyone." By the time the massive Allied operation under Bernard Montgomery finally launched in the north on March 23rd, the strategic situation had already changed. The Rhine was no longer a barrier. It was simply another river the Allied armies had crossed. The plan, designed months earlier, still unfolded with overwhelming force: airborne divisions, thousands of artillery pieces, and massive armored columns. But history had already moved ahead of the plan, and it had done so because one decision, made quietly between two American generals, refused to wait for permission. March 17, 1945, Remagen, Germany. 10 days after American soldiers first ran across the Ludendorff Bridge, the structure finally surrendered. At 3 p.m., weakened by artillery strikes, bomb blasts, and the constant weight of military traffic, the steel arches twisted and collapsed into the Rhine. The bridge that had stunned both armies vanished beneath the river in a roar of tearing metal. 28 American engineers working on repairs were killed when it fell. But by then, the bridge had already done its work. More than 25,000 Allied troops, along with tanks, artillery, and supply vehicles, had crossed the Rhine through that single span. A network of pontoon bridges now stretched across the river nearby, allowing an even greater flood of forces to pour into the German interior. The collapse came too late to change anything. The Rhine, Germany's most powerful defensive symbol, had already been broken. In Berlin, the reaction was explosive. Adolf Hitler reportedly erupted in fury when he learned that the bridge at Remagen had been captured intact. Officers responsible for its demolition were arrested within hours. Several were executed. Hitler's rage reflected a brutal truth. The psychological barrier of the Rhine had mattered as much as its military value. For generations, German leaders had believed the river could halt any invasion from the west. Now, American tanks were driving east beyond it. Inside the Allied command structure, the response was more restrained, but no less revealing. Dwight D. Eisenhower publicly praised the troops who seized the crossing, framing it as a remarkable battlefield opportunity brilliantly exploited. Privately, however, senior officers understood what had truly happened. The crossing at Remagen and the rapid follow-up crossings by George S. Patton farther south had bypassed the carefully choreographed strategy created by Schaeff. The Allied High Command had planned to cross the Rhine, but it had not planned to cross it that way. The decisive momentum had come from the field, from commanders willing to act before the bureaucracy of coalition warfare could intervene. At the center of that moment stood Omar Bradley, whose quiet decision to allow the seizure of the bridge created a reality no one above him could reverse. Because once soldiers were across the Rhine, no commander, no matter how powerful, would order them back. The consequences unfolded rapidly. Within 3 weeks, Allied armies surged hundreds of kilometers into Germany. The Ruhr industrial region was surrounded and destroyed as a fighting force. Entire German armies surrendered in massive pockets. The Western Front disintegrated. The Rhine was the last great geographical promise of German resistance. Once it failed, the war in the West no longer resembled a defensive struggle. It became a collapse. Historians would later examine the moment at Remagen not as a carefully planned triumph, but as a rare fracture in the machinery of Allied command, a moment when battlefield initiative moved faster than strategy. A bridge remained standing when it was supposed to fall. Two generals understood the opportunity before anyone else did, and a single decision, made in minutes and never formally written into the plan, forced the entire Allied command to accept a victory they had never authorized. In war, there are plans, and then there are moments. On March 7, 1945, at a damaged bridge over the Rhine, one of those moments changed the final chapter of the war in Europe.